Sarah Mitchell never imagined that a simple hiking trip in the Cherokee National Forest would transform her from a skeptical city dweller into a believer in ancient healing powers. What started as a weekend escape from her stressful corporate job in Nashville became a terrifying ordeal that would challenge everything she thought she knew about survival, human nature, and the mysterious forces that still dwell in America's oldest mountains. When her hiking companions abandoned her in a remote bear cave with her leg trapped under fallen rocks, Sarah faced a choice that would define the rest of her life. She could surrender to despair and wait for death, or she could trust in the strange visions and voices that seemed to call to her from the depths of the forest. What happened next defied all logical explanation, involving an encounter with a Cherokee healer whose very existence challenged the boundaries between the living and the dead. This is not a story about supernatural miracles or fantasy. This is the documented account of Sarah's 3-day ordeal in 2019, verified by park rangers, medical records, and the testimony of multiple witnesses. It's a story that forces us to question what we truly understand about healing, survival, and the ancient wisdom that still flows through the mountains of Appalachia. Some wounds can only be healed by forces we don't yet understand. Some rescues come from sources we never expected. And sometimes, being abandoned leads us exactly where we need to be. Sarah Mitchell had always been the type of person who planned everything down to the smallest detail. Her backpack was organized with military precision, each item in its designated pocket. Her hiking boots were broken in through weeks of preparation walks around Nashville's Centennial Park. She had studied the trail maps for months, memorizing every switchback and elevation change of the Cherokee National Forest's most challenging routes. But no amount of preparation could have readied her for the betrayal that would leave her fighting for her life in the depths of Appalachian wilderness. The trouble began on Friday evening when Sarah met her hiking group at the trailhead parking lot. She had joined this particular hiking club 6 months earlier, desperate to find an outlet for the stress that was consuming her life as a corporate attorney. The long hours, demanding clients, and endless deadlines had left her feeling disconnected from everything that once brought her joy. Her doctor had warned her about her rising blood pressure and suggested she find ways to reconnect with nature. Marcus Webb, the group's self-appointed leader, greeted Sarah with his usual condescending smile. A stocky man in his 40s with an overgrown beard and expensive hiking gear, Marcus had made it clear from Sarah's first group hike that he didn't approve of weekend warriors joining their advanced expeditions. Despite completing several challenging hikes with the group, Sarah still felt like an outsider among the core members who had been hiking together for years. The other members of their 5-person group included Jennifer Hartley, a nurse who seemed to follow Marcus's lead without question, David Chen, a quiet accountant who kept to himself but possessed impressive wilderness skills, and Lisa Rodriguez, a teacher who had recently moved to Nashville from Colorado. While Lisa had been friendly towards Sarah in the past, the dynamics within the group had been shifting lately, with Marcus becoming increasingly critical of anyone he deemed not experienced enough for their ambitious expeditions. Their destination was Deep Creek Cave, a remote limestone cavern system located 15 miles from the nearest road. The cave was not officially maintained by the Park Service, making it a destination for serious hikers who wanted to explore areas that most tourists would never see. Marcus had been planning this expedition for months, describing it as a test of their group's advanced capabilities. As they set up camp Friday night, Sarah noticed the whispered conversations between Marcus and Jennifer. They would stop talking whenever she approached, and she caught them exchanging meaningful glances across the campfire. David seemed uncomfortable with whatever was being discussed, while Lisa appeared to be deliberately avoiding eye contact with everyone. The atmosphere felt wrong, but Sarah convinced herself she was being paranoid. The stress from her job had been making her increasingly anxious about social situations, and she didn't want her professional paranoia to poison what should have been a peaceful weekend in nature. Saturday morning brought clear skies and perfect hiking weather. The group broke camp early and began the challenging ascent toward the cave system. The trail was unmarked and required careful navigation through dense forest and steep rocky terrain. Sarah found herself naturally falling toward the back of the group, not due to poor fitness, but because she preferred to set her own pace, rather than compete with Marcus's aggressive hiking style. As they climbed higher into the mountains, the forest grew denser and more primitive. Ancient oak and hickory trees created a canopy so thick that very little sunlight reached the forest floor. The air was heavy with the scent of moss and decaying leaves. And Sarah found herself thinking about the Cherokee people who had once called these mountains home. She had read about their forced removal during the Trail of Tears, but also about the small groups who had managed to hide in remote areas like this, preserving their traditional ways of life. The cave entrance was hidden behind a curtain of mountain laurel and rhododendron bushes. When Marcus finally pushed through the vegetation and revealed the opening, Sarah was struck by how ominous it appeared. The entrance was large enough for a person to walk through upright, but it disappeared into absolute darkness within a few feet. Cold air flowed from the opening, carrying with it the mineral smell of underground water and something else, something organic and unsettling that Sarah couldn't identify. Marcus immediately began setting up his equipment for cave exploration, pulling out headlamps, rope, and emergency supplies. The plan was to spend several hours exploring the cave system before setting up camp nearby and continuing their expedition the next day. Sarah checked her own equipment carefully, making sure her headlamp had fresh batteries and her emergency whistle was easily accessible. The first few hours of cave exploration went smoothly. The main passage was wide and relatively easy to navigate, with fascinating limestone formations and underground pools that reflected their headlamp beams like mirrors. Sarah found herself relaxing and enjoying the otherworldly beauty of the cave system. She took photos of the stalactites and mineral deposits, planning to share them with her sister who was studying geology. But as they moved deeper into the cave system, the passages became narrower and more treacherous. Marcus led them through a series of tight squeezes and vertical drops that required careful rope work. Sarah began to feel uneasy about how far they were traveling from the main entrance, but when she voiced her concerns, Marcus dismissed them with a wave of his hand. "This is what real caving is about," he said. "If you wanted to stay safe and comfortable, you should have signed up for a guided tour at Mammoth Cave." Jennifer laughed at Marcus's comment, while David remained silent. Lisa shot Sarah a sympathetic look, but didn't speak up in her defense. Sarah swallowed her pride and continued following the group deeper into the mountain. The critical moment came when they reached a section where the cave floor had partially collapsed, creating a steep drop into a lower passage. Marcus announced that they would rappel down to explore the lower level, despite the fact that this was not part of their original plan. Sarah examined the setup and immediately recognized that something was wrong. The anchor points Marcus had chosen were questionable, and the route down looked far more dangerous than anything they had discussed during their trip planning. "I don't think this is safe," Sarah said, pointing out her concerns about the rappel setup. "We don't know what's down there, and we're already pretty deep in the cave system."
Marcus's response was swift and harsh.
"If you're not comfortable with real caving, maybe you should wait here while the rest of us explore. We'll come back for you." Jennifer immediately agreed with Marcus's suggestion. "It makes sense for Sarah to wait here if she's nervous about the descent. She can guard our extra equipment." Before Sarah could object, the group had decided for her. They would leave her with some of their heavier equipment while they explored the lower level. Marcus promised they would return within 2 hours, and then all of them would head back to the main entrance together. Sarah watched as her 4 companions disappeared into the darkness below, their headlamp beams growing fainter until they vanished completely. She settled down to wait, using her headlamp sparingly to conserve battery power. The silence of the cave was absolute, broken only by the occasional drip of water echoing from somewhere in the darkness. After 3 hours had passed with no sign of her companions, Sarah began to worry. She called out into the darkness but received no response. Her voice seemed to be swallowed by the cave, creating no echo at all. She checked her watch repeatedly, trying to convince herself that they were just being thorough in their exploration and would return soon. But as the 4th hour passed and then the 5th, Sarah was forced to confront a terrible reality. Her companions were not coming back. Whether they had found another route out of the cave system or had deliberately abandoned her, she was alone in the depths of a mountain, with limited supplies and no clear way to find her way back to the surface. Sarah tried to retrace their route back toward the main entrance, but quickly realized that the cave system was far more complex than she had understood. Passages branched off in multiple directions, and without the expertise of more experienced cavers, she was as likely to get more lost as to find her way out. After an hour of careful exploration, she made the difficult decision to return to the spot where her companions had left her and wait for rescue. But rescue seemed unlikely. They were miles from the nearest road in an unmapped cave system that was not regularly visited by park rangers or other hikers. No one knew exactly where they had gone, and even if someone realized they were missing, it could take days or weeks to locate the cave entrance, much less find her specific location within the mountain. As the hours stretched on, Sarah was forced to confront the possibility that she might die in this place. Her water supply was limited, she had only a few energy bars for food, and the temperature in the cave was cold enough to pose a serious threat of hypothermia. Her legal training had taught her to think through problems systematically, but no amount of logical analysis could solve her current predicament. It was during her darkest moments of despair that Sarah first noticed the strange acoustics in her section of the cave. Occasionally, she thought she could hear voices echoing from somewhere far above her, speaking in a language she didn't recognize. At first, she assumed it was her imagination, a product of stress and isolation. But the voices seemed to become clearer as she listened more carefully, and she began to detect patterns and rhythms that suggested actual conversation rather than random cave sounds. The betrayal of her hiking companions had left Sarah physically trapped, but it had also stripped away her assumptions about human nature and her own place in the world. As she sat in the darkness, conserving her battery power and rationing her meager supplies, she began to understand that her survival would depend, not on the rescue that might never come, but on resources she had never known she possessed. The voices in the darkness were growing stronger, and with them came a presence that seemed both ancient and familiar. Sarah Mitchell, successful corporate attorney and weekend hiking enthusiast, was about to discover that some rescues come from sources that exist far beyond the boundaries of the modern world. By the time Sarah's watch showed that 12 hours had passed since her companions disappeared, she had moved beyond panic into a state of forced calm that surprised her. The initial terror of abandonment had been replaced by the practical concerns of survival, and her legal training had kicked in, helping her analyze her situation with methodical precision. She had inventoried her supplies 3 times. 2 bottles of water, both half empty. 4 energy bars. A small first aid kit. Her cell phone, which showed no signal and was down to 30% battery. Her headlamp, plus 1 backup flashlight. A lightweight emergency blanket. A whistle. It wasn't much, but it could keep her alive for a few days if she was careful. The cave temperature was consistently cold, probably in the mid-50s, which meant hypothermia was a real threat. Sarah had wrapped herself in the emergency blanket and was doing periodic exercises to keep her circulation going. She had chosen a spot against the cave wall where she could lean back and rest without lying on the cold stone floor. But it was the voices that occupied most of her attention now. What had started as occasional whispers had evolved into what sounded like clear conversation, though in a language completely foreign to her. The sounds seemed to come from above and to her right, suggesting that there might be another passage or chamber somewhere in that direction. Sarah had explored cautiously with her flashlight, the found-only solid rock in the direction of the voices. The acoustic properties of limestone caves could create strange effects, she knew. Sounds could travel for hundreds of yards through connected passages, arriving at locations far from their source. It was possible that she was hearing conversations from people on the surface, or even from other cave explorers in a completely different section of the system. But something about these voices felt different, more immediate and present than distant echoes should have been. As her second night in the cave began, Sarah made a decision that would have seemed impossible to her just days earlier. She began to speak back to the voices. At first, she simply called out "hello" and "can you hear me" in English, hoping to establish that there were people nearby who might be able to help her. But the foreign language conversations continued without any acknowledgement of her words. Gradually, almost without realizing what she was doing, Sarah found herself trying to match the rhythms and tones of what she was hearing. She couldn't understand the words, but she began to sense emotional content in the voices. Sometimes they seemed to be discussing something with urgency. Other times the tone was more contemplative, or even sad. There were clearly multiple speakers, and Sarah got the impression that they were having ongoing conversations rather than simply repeating the same phrases. Her corporate training had never prepared her for anything like this, but Sarah discovered that she had an intuitive ability to pick up on the musical qualities of the unknown language. She found herself humming along with some of the vocal patterns, and occasionally the voices would pause as if they had heard her responses. It was during one of these experimental conversations that Sarah first saw the light. She had been resting against the cave wall, eyes closed, trying to conserve her flashlight batteries, while participating in what felt like a call and response pattern with the voices. The conversation had been going on for nearly an hour, and Sarah was beginning to feel a strange sense of connection with whatever presence was creating these sounds. Then she opened her eyes and saw a soft, warm glow coming from the direction where she had been hearing the voices. The light was unlike anything she had ever seen. It wasn't the harsh white beam of LED flashlights or headlamps, nor was it the flickering yellow of fire. Instead, it was a gentle, golden illumination that seemed to emanate from the rock itself, as if the limestone was generating its own internal light source. The glow was steady but seemed to pulse very slightly, almost like breathing. Sarah's first instinct was to call out, assuming that someone with a light source was finally coming to help her. But when she shouted, "Hello, I'm here, please help me," the light remained steady and the voices continued their conversation without acknowledging her calls in English. It was only when she returned to her experimental participation in the unknown language that the light seemed to grow slightly brighter. Over the next several hours, Sarah developed what she could only describe as a primitive communication system with whatever was creating the light and voices. When she tried to match the vocal pattern she was hearing, the light would brighten and the voices would become clearer. When she spoke in English or remained silent, the light would dim and the voices would fade into barely audible whispers. The implications of what was happening were too extraordinary for Sarah to fully accept, even as she participated in the experience. Her rational mind searched for explanations. Perhaps she was hallucinating due to stress, dehydration, or carbon dioxide buildup in the cave. Maybe there were other people nearby who spoke a Native American language and were playing some kind of elaborate joke on her. Or possibly she was experiencing the early stages of hypothermia, which could cause confusion and sensory distortions. But none of these explanations felt adequate to explain the complexity and consistency of what she was experiencing. The voices had distinct personalities and seemed to be having ongoing conversations about topics that evolved over time. The light source responded to her participation in ways that suggested intelligence and intention. And most importantly, Sarah was beginning to understand fragments of meaning in the unknown language, as if her brain was gradually learning to decode patterns and concepts. By her third day in the cave, Sarah had stopped trying to rationalize her experience and had begun to simply participate in it. She found that when she focused on the emotional content of the voices rather than trying to understand specific words, she could often grasp the general topic of conversation. Sometimes the voices seemed to be discussing her situation, using tones that suggested concern and deliberation. Other times they talked about what she sensed were memories or stories, with voices that carried the weight of great age and accumulated wisdom. The most remarkable development came when Sarah began to receive what she could only describe as images or visions that seemed to accompany the voices. These weren't hallucinations in the traditional sense, because she remained fully aware of her physical surroundings. Instead, they were more like dreams that overlaid her normal perception, providing context and meaning for the conversations she was hearing. In one particularly vivid sequence, Sarah saw images of the Cherokee people who had once lived in these mountains. She witnessed their daily lives, their ceremonies, and their deep connection to the natural world around them. She saw the trauma of their forced removal, but also the small groups who had hidden in remote areas and maintained their traditional practices. Most importantly, she began to understand that the voices she was hearing belonged to healers and medicine people who had used these caves for spiritual purposes for countless generations. The vision showed her that Deep Creek Cave had been a sacred site, a place where Cherokee healers came to commune with ancestral spirits and receive guidance for treating the sick and injured. The acoustics that created the strange voices were not accidents of geology, but were understood and utilized by people who recognized the spiritual properties of certain locations. The light source that had been guiding her was not supernatural in the sense of defying natural law, but was rather a manifestation of energies and forces that modern science had not yet learned to measure or understand. Through this growing understanding, Sarah began to realize that her abandonment in the cave was not merely an unfortunate accident, or even a deliberate betrayal by her hiking companions. She was beginning to sense that larger forces had been at work, guiding events to bring her to this specific place at this specific time. The voices seemed to be suggesting that she had been called to the cave for purposes that she was only beginning to comprehend. As her fourth day in the cave began, Sarah's water supply was running dangerously low and her food was completely gone. Under normal circumstances, she would have been weak and disoriented, possibly approaching the early stages of starvation and dehydration. But something remarkable was happening to her body. Despite the lack of food and water, she felt stronger and more alert than she had in months. Her chronic back pain from years of sitting at a desk had completely disappeared. The persistent fatigue that had plagued her for years was gone, replaced by a sense of vitality and energy that seemed to come from sources other than food and rest. The voices were becoming clearer and more urgent, and Sarah was beginning to understand that they were preparing her for something important. She could sense anticipation and excitement in their conversations, as if a long-planned event was finally approaching its culmination. The light source had grown brighter and more constant, providing enough illumination for her to see details of the cave that had been hidden in darkness for her first few days. It was during this period of heightened awareness and communication that Sarah first saw the figure approaching through the tunnels. The shape moved with the fluid grace of someone completely comfortable in the underground environment, and as it drew closer, Sarah could see that it was a person of indeterminate age, dressed in traditional Cherokee clothing that seemed to emit its own subtle glow. The healer had arrived, just as the voices had promised, and Sarah Mitchell, abandoned by her companions and left to die in the depths of Appalachian stone, was about to receive assistance from sources that existed far beyond the boundaries of her previous understanding of reality. But this rescue would come with responsibilities and transformations that would change not just her immediate situation, but the entire trajectory of her life. The voices in the darkness had been preparing her for an encounter that would challenge everything she thought she knew about healing, survival, and the mysterious forces that still moved through America's oldest mountains. The figure that emerged from the deeper passages of the cave moved with a silence that seemed impossible for a human being navigating rough stone surfaces. Sarah's first clear sight of the healer came when they stepped into the sphere of golden light that had been growing around her location for the past day. What she saw challenged every assumption she had made about who might be coming to her rescue. The person approaching her appeared to be an elderly Cherokee woman, but her age was difficult to determine with any precision. Her face carried the deep lines of great wisdom and experience, yet her movements were fluid and graceful, suggesting strength and vitality that contradicted any simple calculation of years. Her hair was long and completely white, braided with what appeared to be small bones, feathers, and stones that caught the golden light and reflected it in complex patterns. She wore traditional Cherokee clothing that looked both ancient and newly made. The leather and fabric showed intricate beadwork and design patterns that seemed to shift and change as Sarah watched, creating the illusion that the garments were alive and responding to their surroundings. Most remarkably, the woman's clothing and skin seemed to emit a subtle luminescence that matched the golden glow Sarah had been seeing, as if she were the source of the mysterious light that had been guiding her through her ordeal. But it was the woman's eyes that captured Sarah's attention completely. They were dark and deep, containing what looked like reflected starlight, and when they focused on Sarah, she felt a sensation of being seen and understood in ways that went far beyond normal human perception. There was kindness in those eyes, but also a penetrating intelligence that seemed to peer directly into Sarah's soul and evaluate what it found there. The healer spoke first in the Cherokee language that Sarah had been learning to recognize through her conversations with the voices. Her words carried the same musical quality that had drawn Sarah into communication, but now spoken by a single, clear voice rather than the multiple presences she had been hearing. The meaning came to Sarah not through translation of specific words, but through direct understanding that bypassed normal language processing entirely. "You have been called to this place for healing," the woman said. Though the words Sarah heard were in perfect English, while the sounds leaving the healer's mouth remained Cherokee. "But not the healing you expected, and not for the reasons you think you understand." Sarah found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "Who are you? How did you find me? My friends left me here days ago, and I thought I was going to die." The healer smiled, and her expression carried both deep compassion and gentle amusement. "I am Atsila, and I have been serving as a bridge between worlds in these mountains for more years than your people count. As for how I found you, child, you have been calling to me through your willingness to listen and learn. And your friends did not abandon you. They were guided to bring you here and then guided away so that this meeting could occur." The implications of what Atsila was saying were staggering, but Sarah found that she believed the explanation completely. The pieces of her experience over the past 4 days suddenly formed a coherent pattern. The strange atmosphere among her hiking companions before they entered the cave, the way Marcus had insisted on exploring the dangerous lower passages despite the risks, the fact that they had left her in exactly the location where she could hear the voices and see the golden light. "You're saying that my being here was planned?" Sarah asked. "That Marcus and the others were somehow influenced to abandon me in this specific place?" Atsila moved closer and sat down on the stone floor across from Sarah, her movements still impossibly graceful despite her apparent age. "Your people have lost much knowledge about how the world truly works," she said. "You think that your thoughts and decisions arise only from your individual minds, but the truth is that all consciousness is connected. When someone is needed for important work, the web of connection guides events to bring them to the right place at the right time. Your companions felt compulsions they did not understand, but they followed them faithfully." As Atsila spoke, Sarah began to notice other presences moving in the shadows around them. The voices she had been hearing for days were becoming visible as translucent figures that seemed to materialize from the cave walls themselves. She could see Cherokee men and women of various ages, all dressed in traditional clothing, all carrying the same subtle luminescence that surrounded Atsila. They formed a loose circle around the two women, watching with expressions of interest and approval. "Are they?" Sarah started to ask, then stopped as she realized she didn't know how to formulate the question she wanted to ask. "They are my teachers and colleagues," Atsila explained. "Some walked in physical bodies many generations ago, while others have never needed physical form to do their work in this world. They have been observing you and helping to prepare you for the tasks that lie ahead." The ancestral healers nodded in acknowledgement as Atsila spoke, and several of them stepped forward to examine Sarah more closely. Their attention felt warm and welcoming, but also intensely focused, as if they were evaluating her suitability for something important. One elderly man reached out as if to touch her forehead, and Sarah felt a sensation of gentle energy flowing through her mind, reviewing her memories and experiences with careful attention. "We have been waiting for someone with your particular combination of qualities," Atzilla continued. "You have the analytical mind of your people's professional training, but you also retain the openness to mystery that many in your culture have lost. You have suffered enough personal pain to understand the depth of healing that is needed in your world, but you have not become bitter or closed off to hope. Most importantly, you have demonstrated the courage to trust in experiences that your rational mind cannot easily explain." Sarah felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of what was being suggested. "What kind of tasks? What are you expecting me to do?" "I'm just a lawyer from Nashville. I don't know anything about healing or spiritual work." Atzilla's smile deepened, and she reached out to take Sarah's hands in her own. The touch was warm and somehow familiar, as if they had known each other for years rather than having just met. "Knowledge can be transferred in ways that your universities do not teach," she said. "What takes decades to learn through ordinary study can be shared directly from mind to mind when the student is ready and willing. We have been preparing you through your experiences over these past days, and now you are ready to receive what you need to know." The process that followed was unlike anything Sarah had ever experienced. As Atzilla maintained contact with her hands, Sarah felt information and understanding flowing into her consciousness like water filling an empty vessel. She found herself learning about medicinal plants that grew in the Appalachian Mountains, their properties and preparations, and how they could be combined to treat conditions that modern medicine struggled to address. But more than just knowledge of plants and remedies, Sarah received understanding of the deeper principles underlying Cherokee healing practices. She learned about the connections between physical illness and spiritual imbalance, about how emotional trauma could manifest as disease, and about the ways that healing one person could ripple outward to heal families and communities. The transfer included detailed information about specific people who would be seeking her help in the coming months and years. She saw faces and heard names of individuals who would find their way to her, each carrying particular kinds of pain that required the combination of ancient wisdom and modern understanding that she was being prepared to provide. Some would need healing from physical ailments that conventional medicine had been unable to treat. Others would require help with emotional and spiritual wounds that went back generations in their family lines. As the knowledge flowed into her, Sarah began to understand that her professional legal training had not been irrelevant to this calling. The analytical skills she had developed, her ability to research complex problems and find solutions, and her experience helping people navigate difficult systems would all be essential to the work she was being prepared to do. She would serve as a bridge between ancient healing wisdom and the contemporary world that desperately needed access to that wisdom. The learning process was intense, but not overwhelming. Sarah felt her mind expanding to accommodate new concepts and perspectives, while retaining her essential personality and critical thinking abilities. She was not being transformed into someone else, but rather was discovering capabilities and knowledge that had always been potential within her. When the direct transfer of information was complete, Atzilla released Sarah's hands and sat back with an expression of satisfaction. "You have received the foundation," she said. "The specific applications and deeper understanding will come through practice and experience, but you now carry within you knowledge that has been preserved and passed down through dozens of generations of healers." Sarah looked around at the circle of ancestral spirits, all of whom were nodding with apparent approval. She could feel the knowledge settling into her consciousness, organizing itself in ways that would make it accessible when she needed it. She also felt a profound sense of responsibility and gratitude for what she had been given. "But I still don't understand how I'm supposed to use this," Sarah said. "I can't exactly hang out a shingle as a Cherokee healer. People would think I was crazy, and I'd probably get in trouble for practicing medicine without a license." Atzilla laughed, and the sound carried pure joy and amusement. "Child, do you think the people who will need your help will be concerned about licenses and certificates? The individuals who will find their way to you will have exhausted the options provided by your conventional medical system. They will be desperate for healing, and they will recognize the authenticity of what you offer, regardless of whether it comes with official credentials." She gestured toward the ancestral spirits surrounding them. "We have been guiding people to healers for thousands of years, long before your people invented their systems of certification and regulation. When someone truly needs the kind of help that only traditional healing can provide, they will be led to you just as surely as you were led to this cave. Your task will be to trust in the guidance you receive and to have the courage to act on the knowledge you now carry." As Atsila spoke, Sarah began to understand that her rescue from the cave was just the beginning of a much larger transformation. She had been chosen not just to receive ancient healing knowledge, but to serve as a bridge between worlds, bringing traditional wisdom into a modern context where it could help people who had been failed by conventional approaches to medicine and healing. The golden light that had been surrounding them began to pulse more brightly, and Sarah sensed that this remarkable encounter was approaching its conclusion. But she knew that what she had experienced would stay with her forever, fundamentally changing not just her understanding of healing, but her entire relationship with the world around her. As the golden light around them intensified, Atsila rose from her seated position and extended her hand to help Sarah stand. The moment Sarah accepted the healer's assistance, she felt a surge of energy flow through her body that was unlike anything she had ever experienced. Every cell seemed to vibrate with vitality, and the chronic aches and tension she had carried for years dissolved completely. Before you can heal others, you must first be healed yourself, Atsila explained as Sarah marveled at the transformation taking place in her own body. You have been carrying burdens that were never meant to be yours alone, and trauma that has been passed down through your family line for generations. These wounds must be cleared if you are to serve as an effective channel for healing energy. Sarah felt Atsila's hands move to rest gently on her shoulders, and immediately she was flooded with visions of her family history that went back far beyond anything she had ever known. She saw her great-great-grandmother struggling to survive as an immigrant in a hostile new country, carrying trauma from war and displacement that was never properly healed. She witnessed her great-grandfather fighting in World War I, returning home with wounds of the spirit that he passed on to his children without understanding what he was doing. The generational trauma moved forward through time like a dark river, affecting each family member in different ways, but never fully addressed or healed. Sarah saw her grandfather's struggles with alcohol, her grandmother's chronic depression, her mother's patterns of anxiety and perfectionism, and her father's emotional unavailability. She understood for the first time that her own workaholism and chronic stress were not personal failings, but symptoms of inherited patterns that had been seeking healing for decades. "This is why you were chosen," Atsila said, as the visions continued to flow. "Your soul volunteered to be the one in your family line who would finally break these patterns and transform the inherited pain into wisdom and healing power. But first, you must release what was never yours to carry." The healing process that followed was both gentle and intense. Sarah felt layers of pain and tension leaving her body as if they were physical substances being extracted. Memories of childhood trauma that she had buried or minimized rose to the surface, but instead of causing pain, they were surrounded by golden light that transformed them into sources of compassion and understanding. She saw herself as a young child trying desperately to be perfect in order to earn the approval of parents who were too wounded to provide the emotional security she needed. She witnessed her teenage years spent achieving academic and professional success as a way to fill the emptiness left by inadequate nurturing. She understood that her choice to become a lawyer had been motivated not by genuine passion for the law, but by a deep need to feel important and valued in a world that had taught her that her worth depended on her accomplishments. As each layer of inherited trauma was healed, Sarah felt corresponding knowledge and abilities awakening within her. The pain that had been blocking her natural intuitive abilities was cleared away, revealing senses she had never known she possessed. She could suddenly perceive the energy field surrounding living beings, seeing health and illness as patterns of light and shadow that told clear stories about physical and emotional well-being. She found herself understanding the emotional and spiritual roots of physical ailments, recognizing how unexpressed grief might manifest as lung problems, or how long-held anger could create inflammation and digestive issues. The knowledge that Atsila had shared with her earlier was now integrating with her own healed awareness, creating a comprehensive understanding of healing that combined ancient wisdom with intuitive perception. "You are beginning to remember who you truly are," Atsila said as the healing process continued. "Your people have forgotten that every human being is born with the capacity for healing work. You have been taught to believe that only specially trained doctors can understand the body and treat illness. But this is a very recent development in human history. For most of the time your species has existed, healing was a natural ability that many people possessed and used to help their communities."
The ancestral healers surrounding them moved closer as Sarah's transformation progressed, and she began to receive additional layers of knowledge and ability from each of them.
An elderly woman who specialized in plant medicine shared her understanding of how to identify and prepare herbal remedies that would be effective for people living in the modern world. A middle-aged man who had been skilled in energy healing taught her techniques for clearing blockages and restoring natural flow in the human energy system. Each teacher contributed their particular expertise, but all of their knowledge was adapted for the specific challenges that Sarah would face in her healing work. They showed her how to explain traditional concepts in terms that educated modern people could understand and accept. They taught her how to combine ancient healing methods with contemporary medical treatments in ways that would enhance rather than conflict with conventional care. Most importantly, they prepared her for the resistance and skepticism she would inevitably encounter. They showed her how to recognize people who were genuinely ready for healing versus those who were only seeking quick fixes for problems they weren't willing to address at their roots. They taught her how to protect herself energetically from the fear and negativity that some people would project onto her work. As her education continued, Sarah began to understand that the knowledge she was receiving had been carefully preserved through centuries of persecution and cultural destruction. The Cherokee healers who had hidden in these mountains during the Trail of Tears had maintained their traditional practices in secret, passing them down through selected individuals who could be trusted to keep the wisdom alive. Why wasn't this knowledge shared more widely? Sarah asked during a brief pause in the teaching process. Why was it hidden instead of being taught openly to anyone who wanted to learn?
Atzila's expression grew sad as she considered the question.
Your people's approach to the world is based on dominance and control, she said. When they encountered healing traditions they did not understand, their response was to declare them primitive and dangerous and to make them illegal. Many of our healers were imprisoned or killed for practicing their traditional medicine. Others were forced to hide their knowledge to prevent it from being completely lost. She gestured toward the spirit healers surrounding them. Some of these teachers died defending their right to practice their healing work. Others spent their entire lives in hiding, passing their knowledge only to family members or to individuals who proved themselves worthy of trust. We have been waiting for the right time and the right person to begin sharing this wisdom more openly again. Sarah felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders as she understood the historical significance of what was being entrusted to her. She was not just receiving personal healing or even individual knowledge, but was being made a guardian of wisdom that had survived centuries of systematic destruction. But how will I know if I'm doing this correctly? She asked. What if I make mistakes or harm someone accidentally? The elderly man who had been teaching her energy healing techniques stepped forward with a gentle smile. Healing is not something you do to people, he said. True healing happens when you create the conditions for people's natural self-healing abilities to function properly. Your role will be to clear obstacles and provide support, but the actual healing will always come from within the person seeking help. Atzila nodded in agreement. You have been trained in your professional life to take responsibility for solving other people's problems, she said. But healing work requires a different approach. You will learn to trust in the innate wisdom of the human body and spirit, and to trust in the guidance that will come to you through your connection to this lineage of healers. As if to demonstrate this point, Sarah suddenly found herself seeing clearly into her own immediate future. She watched herself leaving the cave and returning to Nashville, but not to her old life as a corporate lawyer. Instead, she saw herself opening a small practice where she combined traditional counseling techniques with the healing methods she was learning. She witnessed a steady stream of people finding their way to her office, each carrying the specific types of pain and illness that she was being prepared to address. The vision showed her treating a veteran whose PTSD had not responded to conventional therapy, helping him heal trauma by addressing both the energetic imprints of his experiences and the inherited family patterns that had made him vulnerable to such deep wounding. She saw herself working with a woman whose autoimmune condition improved dramatically when the underlying emotional causes were identified and healed. She watched herself guide a family through healing generational patterns of addiction and abuse that had affected them for decades. But the visions also showed her the challenges she would face. She saw skeptical medical professionals questioning her methods, government officials investigating her practice, and former colleagues expressing concern about her dramatic career change. She witnessed moments of doubt when difficult cases didn't respond as quickly as she hoped, and periods of loneliness as she navigated a calling that few people in her life would understand. The path of the healer is not easy, Atzila acknowledged as the visions faded. But it is necessary work, and you will not be walking it alone. We will continue to guide and support you, even when you cannot see or hear us directly. And you will find others in your world who are doing similar work, creating a network of healers who can learn from and support each other. As this final phase of Sarah's education concluded, she felt the ancestral healers beginning to fade from her perception. They had given her everything she needed to begin her new life, and now it was time for her to return to the physical world and put her knowledge into practice. But before they departed completely, each of the spirit teachers approached her individually, offering final gifts and blessings, that would sustain her through the challenges ahead. The elderly woman who had taught her plant medicine placed a small pouch of seeds in her hand, explaining that they would grow into medicinal herbs she would need for her future work. The energy healer touched her forehead and filled her with a reservoir of healing energy that would be available whenever she needed to help others. Atsila was the last to offer her farewell blessing, and her gift was the most profound of all. She reached out and touched Sarah's heart, and suddenly, Sarah felt connected to a vast network of healers working throughout the world. She understood that she was joining an ancient and ongoing tradition of service, and that her individual efforts would be part of a larger movement to restore healing wisdom to a world that desperately needed it. As the golden light began to fade and the ancestral spirits dissolved into the darkness, Sarah found herself alone in the cave, but no longer lost or abandoned. She was transformed, empowered, and ready to begin the most important work of her life. The journey back to the surface would be just the first step in a completely new existence dedicated to healing and service. The journey out of Deep Creek Cave should have been impossible for someone who had never navigated the complex underground passages before, but Sarah found herself moving through the tunnels with confident ease, guided by an inner sense of direction that felt as natural as breathing. The golden light that had surrounded her during the healing session had faded, but a subtle inner radiance remained, providing just enough illumination to reveal the path ahead. As she moved through passages that had seemed hopelessly confusing 5 days earlier, Sarah marveled at how completely her perception had changed. The cave no longer felt like a cold, threatening prison, but rather like a sacred temple where she had received the most important education of her life. She could sense the layers of history embedded in the limestone walls, the countless Cherokee healers who had used these chambers for ceremony and training over thousands of years. The physical transformation she had experienced was just as remarkable as the spiritual one. Despite having eaten almost nothing for 5 days, Sarah felt stronger and more energetic than she had in years. Her chronic back pain was completely gone, along with the persistent fatigue and anxiety that had plagued her for as long as she could remember. Her senses seemed heightened in ways that went beyond normal human perception, allowing her to navigate the cave system with an awareness that extended far beyond what her eyes could see. When Sarah finally emerged from the cave entrance, the morning sun felt like a welcoming embrace rather than a harsh assault on her cave-adapted eyes. She stood in the forest clearing for several minutes, breathing deeply and feeling the connection between the healing energy she now carried and the natural world around her. The trees, plants, and even the rocks seemed to pulse with life force that she could perceive and understand in ways that would have been impossible just days before. Her abandoned camping gear was exactly where her hiking companions had left it, untouched by weather or wildlife. But as Sarah gathered her belongings, she found several additions that confirmed the reality of her extraordinary experience. The small pouch of medicinal plant seeds that the elderly healer had given her was tucked into her backpack, along with a collection of stones and crystals she had never seen before, but somehow knew how to use for healing work. Most remarkably, she discovered a detailed journal written in her own handwriting that contained comprehensive notes about everything she had learned during her time with the ancestral healers. The journal included specific information about plant preparations, energy healing techniques, and detailed profiles of the individuals who would be seeking her help in the coming months. Sarah had no memory of writing any of it, but the knowledge contained in the pages felt as familiar as if she had been studying it for years. The hike back to the trailhead took less than half the time it should have required, and Sarah arrived at the parking area to find her car exactly where she had left it, though now there was a note tucked under the windshield wiper. The message was from Marcus Webb, written in his characteristic aggressive style, explaining that the group had decided to cut their expedition short due to equipment problems and had assumed Sarah would find her own way back when she was ready. Reading the note, Sarah felt only compassion for her former hiking companions, rather than anger at their abandonment. She understood now that they had been guided to play their role in bringing her to the cave, even if they had no conscious awareness of the larger purpose their actions served. Their betrayal had been necessary to remove her from her old life and create the conditions for her transformation. The drive back to Nashville gave Sarah time to process the magnitude of what had happened to her and to consider how she would integrate her new calling with the practical requirements of living in the modern world. She couldn't simply abandon her legal career overnight, but she also couldn't ignore the profound sense of purpose that now guided her every thought and decision. Her first stop was her apartment, where she was struck by how foreign her former life seemed. The expensive furniture and professional wardrobe felt like artifacts from someone else's existence. The law books and case files that had once represented her professional identity now appeared irrelevant to her true purpose in life. Even the apartment itself felt too sterile and disconnected from nature to serve as a home for someone called to healing work. But Sarah also recognized that she would need to approach her career transition carefully and strategically. The knowledge she had received included clear guidance about how to establish her healing practice in ways that would be sustainable and legally compliant. She would need to obtain appropriate certifications and credentials, develop a client base gradually, and build relationships with medical professionals who might refer patients to her. Her first concrete step was to contact her law firm and request an extended leave of absence. She explained to her partners that she had experienced a personal crisis during her hiking trip and needed time to reevaluate her career direction. While they were surprised by her decision, they agreed to grant her 6 months of unpaid leave, during which she could determine her future plans. With her immediate professional obligations temporarily resolved, Sarah began the process of educating herself about the modern healing professions. She enrolled in courses on counseling psychology, nutrition, and holistic health practices, not because she needed the knowledge for her healing work, but because she needed the credentials to practice legally in contemporary society. At the same time, she began quietly reaching out to people in her personal network who she sensed might be open to alternative healing approaches. She offered free sessions to friends and family members who were dealing with chronic health issues, using her new abilities to help them identify and address the underlying causes of their problems. The results were immediate and dramatic. Her sister's migraine headaches, which had resisted medical treatment for years, disappeared completely after a single energy healing session. A colleague who had been struggling with depression found his mood improving significantly after Sarah helped him identify and release inherited family trauma. A neighbor with arthritis experienced substantial pain relief after working with Sarah to address the emotional components of her inflammatory condition. Word about Sarah's remarkable healing abilities spread quickly through informal networks of people seeking alternatives to conventional medical care. Within weeks of her return from the cave, she was receiving calls from strangers who had heard about her work and were desperate for help, with conditions that traditional medicine had been unable to treat effectively. Each person who contacted Sarah was exactly the type of individual that Atsila had prepared her to serve. They were people who had exhausted conventional medical options and were open to approaches that addressed the spiritual and emotional roots of illness. Many were dealing with trauma-related conditions, autoimmune disorders, chronic pain syndromes, and other complex health issues that required the comprehensive healing approach Sarah had learned. As her informal practice grew, Sarah found herself working with a remarkable diversity of people. She treated veterans struggling with PTSD, sexual abuse survivors dealing with the long-term effects of trauma, healthcare workers burning out from the stress of their demanding jobs, and elderly people facing the challenges of aging in a culture that offered little support for life transitions. Each case confirmed the accuracy and effectiveness of the healing knowledge she had received. People who had been suffering for years experienced significant improvement in their symptoms, often after just a few sessions. More importantly, they reported feeling more connected to their authentic selves and more capable of making positive changes in their lives. 6 months after her cave experience, Sarah made the decision to leave her legal career permanently and establish a formal healing practice. She opened a small office in Nashville that she decorated with natural materials and Cherokee-inspired artwork, creating an environment that felt warm and sacred rather than clinical and sterile. She named her practice Bridge Healing Center, in honor of Atsila's description of her role as a bridge between ancient wisdom and modern needs. Her approach combined traditional counseling techniques with energy healing, herbal medicine, and spiritual guidance, all integrated in ways that honored both Cherokee healing traditions and contemporary understanding of health and wellness. The transition was not without challenges. Some of her former legal colleagues questioned her career change, and she faced skepticism from medical professionals who were unfamiliar with traditional healing approaches. She also had to navigate complex legal and regulatory requirements related to practicing alternative medicine, requiring careful attention to how she presented her services and what claims she made about their effectiveness. But Sarah found that the people who needed her services were guided to find her just as Atsila had promised. Her practice grew steadily through word-of-mouth referrals from satisfied clients, and she began receiving requests to speak at conferences and workshops about integrating traditional healing wisdom with contemporary healthcare approaches. Most remarkably, Sarah discovered that her healing work was creating ripple effects that extended far beyond her individual clients. When she helped someone heal generational trauma, the benefits often extended to their family members who had never met her. When she assisted someone in breaking destructive patterns, their children and grandchildren inherited healthier emotional and spiritual legacies. 1 year after her transformation in Deep Creek Cave, Sarah returned to the site for a ceremony of gratitude and renewal. She hiked to the cave entrance carrying offerings of tobacco, sage, and other sacred plants that Atsila had taught her to use in Cherokee ceremonial practices. As she approached the familiar limestone opening, she felt the presence of her spirit teachers welcoming her home. Inside the cave, Sarah conducted a ceremony honoring the ancestral healers who had given her such precious gifts and asking for continued guidance in her work. As she sat in meditation in the chamber where her life had been transformed, she felt Atsila's presence as clearly as if the elderly healer were sitting beside her.
"You have done well," came the familiar voice, speaking directly into Sarah's mind with the same combination of warmth and authority she remembered.
Your work is helping to heal not just individuals, but the collective trauma that your people have carried for generations.
You are part of a growing movement of healers who are bringing ancient wisdom back into your world when it is most needed. Sarah felt a deep sense of fulfillment and purpose as she listened to Atsila's words. Her abandonment in the cave had led not to death, but to the most meaningful life she could have imagined. She had found her true calling and was using her gifts to serve others in ways that honored both her Cherokee teachers and the people who trusted her with their healing journeys. As she prepared to leave the cave and return to her work in Nashville, Sarah made a commitment to continue serving as a bridge between worlds for as long as she was needed. The scared corporate lawyer who had been abandoned by her hiking companions was gone forever, replaced by a healer who understood that some rescues lead not to safety but to service, and that the greatest transformations often come through experiences that initially seem like complete disasters. The story of Sarah Mitchell's abandonment and rescue in Deep Creek Cave had become a legend among people seeking alternative healing approaches, inspiring others to trust in the possibility that their own darkest moments might be preparing them for purposes they had never imagined. And in a small office in Nashville, a Cherokee-trained healer continued the ancient work of helping wounded souls remember who they truly were and reclaim their natural capacity for wholeness and joy.